Snow still clung to the north face of the ridges when Jonas Hale heard the cry. A thin, broken sound that did not belong to any creature he'd hunted in 20 years of mountain winters. And for a long moment, he stood still among the pines, the rifle lowered, the wind cold enough to bite through his coat. He thought it might be an animal caught in a trap until the cry came again, softer, like someone trying not to die. Following the sound, he moved through brush heavy with ice until he found her near the creek, half buried in drifted snow, her skin the color of copper under frost, a streak of blood frozen along her shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her dress was torn, her bare feet blue with cold, and when she saw the man with the beard and rifle, her hand twitched toward a knife that wasn't there. Jonas knelt slow, saying nothing. He had seen enough death to know when it wanted company. He slid his pack under her head and broke the ice at the edge of the stream to wet her lips. When her eyes flicked open, he saw not fear first, but defiance, the kind that survives long after reason. She whispered a word in Apache he didn't know, and then lost consciousness. He hesitated before lifting her. Taking her meant trouble, maybe worse than any bear or bounty, but leaving her meant something uglier, the kind of choice that had once ruined him. He carried her across the ridge to his cabin, each step sinking deep, the snow squealing under his boots, his breath fogging like smoke. Inside, he laid her near the hearth and stripped off his coat, draping it over her while he stoked the fire higher. The girl shivered once, then still again, her hand clutching something around her neck, a small bone pendant carved with patterns he couldn't read. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke and iron from the valley below, signs of riders, maybe soldiers, maybe worse. Jonas cursed under his breath and bolted the door. He poured a bit of whiskey on her wound, cleaned it, and sat back against the wall as the storm thickened. He had spent years avoiding both people and their wars. Yet tonight, both had found him. The fire cracked, and he realized the sound in the pines had followed him inside. Not as a cry now, but as the quiet breathing of something fragile he wasn't sure he deserved to save. By morning, the storm had buried the world beyond his cabin in white silence. A stillness so deep it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. And Jonas Hale woke to the sound of the fire, sighing low, the kind that means both safety and warning. The girl still slept, her wound clean but raw, her lips pale against the shadows of her skin. He had done what he could, whiskey, bandage, prayer half-muttered, but the fever that clung to her was something he couldn't shoot or chase. When she stirred, her eyes blinked open sharp and dark, the gaze of someone raised to see danger before mercy. She tried to rise, whispering words he couldn't follow, and her hand went to her neck, finding the bone pendant still there. Jonas lifted his palms, showing they were empty. "You're safe here," he said, though the word felt strange in his mouth. She frowned at his accent, then studied the cabin, the single bed, the rough-hewn walls, the pelts hanging from rafters. She asked something in Apache. When he didn't answer, she tried again in broken English. "You soldier?" He shook his head. Trapper, hunter, just a man with too many ghosts. Her shoulders eased a fraction, though mistrust never left her eyes. He asked her name, and she said Naya, the word carrying the strength of something that refused to fade. He told her his and offered her water. She drank, then slept again, the fever pulling her back under. Jonas stepped outside, needing air. The storm had passed, leaving sky clear and hard blue. He followed the ridge and found tracks, horses a dozen or more. cutting across the valley below. The pattern told him trained riders, cavalry maybe. He felt his stomach knot. Soldiers didn't ride this far north unless chasing something. He returned to the cabin fast, checked the rifle, set snares near the back trail, then sat beside her again. Naya mumbled in her sleep, the words falling soft but desperate. He caught only one he understood. Taji. A name, maybe her father's. He watched her fingers twitch around the pendant, as if it were an anchor. He wondered what kind of message it carried, what tribe she belonged to, and what price the mountains would ask for sheltering her. Outside, a hawk circled slow above the trees, tracing a widening loop. And Jonas couldn't shake the thought that everything hunted by man eventually learns to look up before it looks around. By the third day, the snow began to soften under the noon sun, and water dripped from the eaves like a clock counting down to something Jonas Hale couldn't yet name. Inside the cabin, Naya sat propped against the wall, her color better, her hair combed through with his old bone-handled knife. She said little, but her eyes followed every sound outside, the creak of timber, the caw of a raven, the faint, distant echo of hooves, too far to trust as memory. Jonas boiled beans over the fire, his movements slow, deliberate, the way a man works when silence is the only company that doesn't judge. When he offered her a bowl, she took it with both hands, bowed slightly before eating, and said a single word in Apache that meant thanks. He nodded, though he understood it more from her tone than the sound. When she finished, she looked toward the door and asked, "You live alone?" He said, "World's quieter that way." She studied him, then said, "Quiet, not always peace." The word struck harder than he expected. He poured himself coffee gone bitter and stared into it like it might hold a map back to who he'd been before war, before exile. Naya noticed the scars along his forearm and asked softly, "You fight?" Jonas hesitated, then told her about a cavalry ambush years ago, how he'd fought for men who called it law but left villages burning behind them. He said he left when he realized the smoke didn't rise from justice, but from homes. She listened without flinching, then reached for her pendant and held it up between them. It was carved with symbols, spirals, lines, and what looked like the outline of a hawk. "My father say it means breath of spirit," she said. "If wind stop, life stop too. He say never let fear steal wind." Jonas stared at it, wondering how much breath he'd already lost to regret. Before he could answer, the stillness outside cracked. A single shot far off, echoing through the pines. Jonas was on his feet, rifle in hand, moving to the window slit he'd cut years ago. Smoke rose faintly from the south trail. "Soldiers," he muttered. Naya's face paled. Her hand gripped the pendant. "They find me." He nodded once. "Then they'll find both of us." He kicked dirt over the fire, grabbed his coat and motioned for her to stay close. The mountain had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that waits before it breaks. The first rider appeared at dusk, a black silhouette against the dying light, his horse slick with frost and breath steaming in the cold. Jonas Hale watched from behind a fallen log near the cabin's edge, his rifle resting across his knees. Naya crouched beside him, her eyes wide but steady. More riders followed, 6 in all, moving with the precision of men who'd spent their lives obeying orders, their blue coats dulled by dust and distance. The lead man raised a hand, signaling halt, and Jonas recognized him even from here. Corporal Mason, once a friend, now the kind of law the frontier forged when mercy got in the way. They dismounted and began circling the clearing. Jonas whispered, "Don't move till I say." Naya nodded, clutching the bone pendant tight enough to leave a mark. The soldiers spread out, one heading toward the creek where the snow still showed faint tracks. Jonas felt his heartbeat slow, that familiar calm that had carried him through fights he hadn't wanted to survive. Mason called out, "Hale, you up there? We've got orders from Fort Stanton, Apache Girl's property of the Crown now. You're harboring her. It's treason." The word hung in the air like a noose. Jonas rose slowly, rifle lowered but ready, and stepped into view. "She's no one's property," he said. "You know that." Mason's face tightened, recognition fighting with duty. "They burned a whole camp, Jonas. You can't fix it with one girl." Jonas answered, "I ain't fixing anything, just refusing to break what's already bent." Behind him, Naya whispered something soft in her language. A prayer, maybe. Mason motioned for two men to flank left. Jonas warned them off. Voice steady, "You take one more step, and the mountain will eat you whole." The soldiers hesitated. The wind moaned through the trees like a ghost that knew the ending. Then a shout came from the ridge. Another figure appeared, a scout screaming words none of them expected. "Riders, hundreds of them." In the fading light, the southern horizon shimmered with movement, dark shapes cresting the ridge like a tide of shadows. Naya's breath caught. She whispered, "My people." Mason turned pale, muttering, "Good God." Jonas stared at her, then back at the ridge. The sun slipped away entirely, and what replaced it wasn't night, but the weight of something vast and unstoppable rolling down the mountain, carrying both salvation and reckoning in the same breath. Darkness fell fast as if the mountain had swallowed the sun whole, and by the time the riders reached the lower ridge, the air trembled with the sound of hooves striking frozen ground. A thunder deeper than any storm Jonas Hale had heard. The soldiers scrambled, Mason barking orders to form a line, rifles snapping into position, but fear had already taken their aim. From the tree line came a low chant, hundreds of voices woven together, the Apache war call rising and breaking like waves. Naya pressed closer to Jonas, her voice shaking as she said, "They think you took me. They come for blood." Jonas looked at her, then at Mason, and realized the mountain had drawn a circle none of them could escape. "Then we better teach them what truth looks like," he said, grabbing a lantern from the porch and stepping into the open snow. The glow carved his shape against the dark as he raised the light high, signaling not defiance, but surrender. The chant faltered. A few riders slowed. Chief Taji emerged from the shadows, feathers braided with frost, his horse snorting clouds of steam. His eyes locked on Naya, and for a heartbeat, everything, the soldiers, the cold, the fear, fell silent. Naya broke from cover, stumbling through the snow toward him. "Father," she cried, her voice tearing through the wind. The chief dismounted, caught her in his arms, his hands shaking as if touching a ghost. Behind him, warriors lowered their spears, murmurs rippling like wind through dry grass. Mason exhaled, lowering his rifle, but his men still aimed, uncertain which enemy to fear. Taji looked up, eyes burning through Jonas. "You hurt her?" he asked. Jonas shook his head. "Saved her." He tossed the pendant across the snow. The chief caught it, turning it in his palm before lifting it to his lips. "This holds her spirit," he said. "You guarded it." He studied Jonas longer, then nodded once, the kind of gesture that weighed more than words. But the peace trembled when one soldier fired. Accident, panic, who could tell? And the bullet grazed a warrior's arm. Shouts erupted, chaos bursting like dry pine in fire. Jonas dove, pulling Naya down. Mason screamed for ceasefire, but the hill erupted in flame and noise. In that instant, Jonas saw mercy die and hope recoil, yet he refused to aim his rifle. He threw the lantern into the snow, light scattering in pieces, and shouted into the roar, "Stop! She's safe! You're all safe!" For a moment, no one listened. Then Naya's voice rose above it, pure, unbroken, calling her tribe's song of peace into the dark. The mountain heard her first, then the rest followed. When the gunfire finally stuttered out, the night held its breath, broken only by the echo of horses snorting and the crackle of scattered flames licking at the snow-soaked brush. The air reeked of smoke and gunpowder, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. Jonas Hale rose slowly from where he had thrown himself across Naya, his coat burned at the hem, his cheek cut from a stray splinter. The soldiers had fallen back to the edge of the creek, their rifles trembling in hands too cold and guilty to hold steady, while the Apache warriors ringed them in a silent semicircle, faces painted, weapons ready, but motionless. Chief Taji stood in the center, his daughter behind him, one hand pressed to her father's arm, her other clutching the blood-stained pendant. Between them and the soldiers lay a single casualty, a young warrior, no older than Naya, breathing raggedly into the snow. The shot that had started everything now pulsed in the darkness, like a wound refusing to close. Mason stepped forward, lowering his weapon, voice cracking as he said, "It was an accident." The words sounded small, empty against the mountain's echo. Taji's gaze flicked to Jonas. "Your people do not know accident," he said quietly. "Only excuse?" Jonas's jaw clenched. "Then let me pay for it." The chief studied him, eyes unreadable, and answered, "The mountain already knows your debt." He turned to the fallen youth, knelt and pressed his palm to the boy's chest. When the breath stopped, he looked up again, face carved from stone. "We bury him here, so the wind remembers." Naya's voice broke the silence, pleading, "Father, no more." Her words trembled, half English, half Apache. Yet the meaning cut clean. For the first time, Taji's shoulders eased. He gestured to the soldiers. "Go! Tell your officers the mountain keeps its own justice." Mason nodded, ashamed, and began leading his men downslope. Jonas moved toward the fire to help lift the fallen warrior's body, but the chief stopped him. "You already carried one life from death," he said. "That is enough." Jonas stepped back, head bowed. Naya turned to him, eyes shining through the smoke. "They will not forget," she whispered. "Neither will I." He nodded once, the ache in his chest heavier than the mountains around them. Above, the wind shifted, carrying away the last of the smoke. And for the first time in years, Jonas realized he had nowhere left to run, and no reason to try. By dawn, the snow had crusted hard again, glittering under the pale light as the tribe prepared to leave the ridge, their breath turning to ribbons in the cold air. The burial mound rose small but proud beneath a cedar, smoke still rising from the embers left to guard it. Jonas Hale stood apart, hat in his hands, watching Chief Taji trace ash across his forehead before lifting his daughter's pendant to the sunrise. Naya knelt beside him, lips moving in prayer, her voice too low to catch, but strong enough to still the restless air. When she rose, she walked to Jonas, her eyes older than her years, saying, "You showed mercy when the world gave none. My father sees that now." He looked away, uncomfortable beneath the gratitude. "Mercy's easy when you've run out of bullets," he said. She smiled faintly, replying, "Harder when you still carry them." Her gaze drifted toward the smoke curling from his cabin below. "You'll leave?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not yet. The mountain still got ghosts to feed." She nodded, as if she understood. Behind them, Taji approached, his face grave but calmer, the war paint streaked pale by frost. He offered Jonas a knife, beautiful, hand-forged, the handle carved with the same hawk symbol as Naya's pendant. "For the next man who forgets what mercy looks like," the chief said. Jonas accepted it with both hands, feeling the weight of more than metal. The chief then turned to Naya. "You will ride with us. The tribe needs its healer." Naya's eyes filled, torn between blood and choice. Jonas met her gaze. "Go," he said quietly. "Your place is where hearts still believe in you." She touched his hand once, quick as breath, then stepped back toward her father. The warriors began to move, horses crunching through snow, the sound rolling like slow thunder down the valley. Mason and his men were long gone. The world had shrunk to wind, ice, and farewells. Jonas watched until the last rider vanished into the trees, then turned toward his cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney again, faint but steady. He sheathed the knife by the door and sat beside the fire, staring into the coals until they blurred. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt earned, like the breath of spirit Naya had spoken of. A reminder that even in the coldest land, a man could still choose to be warm. The valley woke in a gray hush, mist lifting off the snow like breath from the mountain's lungs. And Jonas Hale stood beside the small fire outside his cabin, watching the first rays of sun slip between the pines. The smoke from last night's embers curled into the cold, carrying with it the scent of cedar and ash. Two things that never truly left a man who had seen battle. He thought he was alone until the quiet broke with the sound of hoofbeats, not the measured rhythm of a patrol, but the rolling thunder of many. He turned and saw them cresting the ridge. Warriors in painted buckskin, their lances tipped with feathers that flashed in the pale light. There were hundreds. Too many to count before his mind gave up the number. At their head rode Chief Taji, his daughter Naya beside him, wrapped in a crimson shawl. The tribe slowed as they reached the clearing, the snow parting beneath their horses like water before a tide. Jonas set his rifle aside, stepped forward, and waited, because fear had no place left to hide. The chief dismounted first, the earth crunching under his boots, and approached until they stood a breath apart. "You could have killed," Taji said. "You did not." Jonas nodded once. "Killing's easy. Living after isn't." For a long heartbeat, neither spoke, only the wind threading through the branches above. Then the chief lifted his hand, and a line of riders advanced, carrying bundles wrapped in hide and cloth. Blankets, dried meat, a carved staff, and a new horse with a saddle marked in red paint. 300 come not for war, Taji said. "We come to thank the man who gave one life back to the mountain." Jonas looked past him at Naya. She smiled, shy but sure. "My father says you're brother now," she said. "Not by blood, by breath." The words caught him harder than any blow. He tried to answer, but only managed a nod. The chief placed a single feather the color of dusk into Jonas's hand. "When wind touches you, you remember this day," he said. The warriors raised their lances in salute, the sound of their cry rolling like thunder, yet filled with joy, not rage. When they turned to leave, the snow glowed under the rising sun, and for once, Jonas felt the world grow quiet inside him. Mercy, it seemed, could echo louder than any gun. By the time the last rider vanished into the timberline, the sound of hooves had already faded into memory, leaving only the hush of the mountain and the faint smell of pine smoke drifting from the smoldering fire. Jonas Hale stood motionless, feather still clenched in his fist, unsure whether the tremor in his hands came from the cold or from something deeper, relief heavy enough to hurt. His cabin, battered and blackened at the edges, looked smaller than he remembered. But somehow it felt like home again. The new horse snorted beside the trough, its hide gleaming chestnut under the morning light, and Jonas reached out, brushing snow from its mane. "Guess it's just us now," he muttered, the sound of his voice startling in the quiet. Inside, the air still carried traces of Naya's presence, the faint scent of sage and wood smoke. The blanket she'd folded neatly before leaving. He sat beside the hearth, staring at the dying coals, and thought of all the times he'd believed solitude was safety, how the years had carved him hollow enough to mistake silence for peace. Outside, the snow began to melt in thin rivulets that trickled down the slope toward the creek, carrying soot and ash into water that didn't judge where it came from. He stepped outside again, turning his face toward the wind, and for a long while he simply listened. The rustle of the trees, the distant cry of an eagle, the steady rhythm of his own breathing. The world, once hostile, now sounded alive. From the ridge above, a single figure appeared on horseback. It was Mason, alone, his coat torn, his expression worn thin by shame. Jonas didn't reach for his rifle. The man stopped a few yards away, dismounted, and removed his hat. "Fort Stanton's done here," he said quietly. "They won't come back. Word is spreading. The tribes say a mountain ghost saved one of their own." Jonas almost laughed. Ghost sounds about right. Mason looked at the ground. "You did what none of us had the courage to." Jonas shook his head. "No, just stopped being afraid of what doing right costs." The two men stood in silence until the wind took Mason's farewell and carried it away down the valley. When Jonas finally turned back toward his cabin, the feather slipped from his hand, spinning once before landing gently in the snow. It lay there catching sunlight, as if the mountain itself had decided to keep a piece of his mercy. That night, the mountain breathed slow beneath a rising moon, its ridges silvered, its forests whispering the kind of silence only hard-won peace can earn. Jonas Hale sat by his hearth, the flames small but steady, shadows painting his cabin walls like old stories fading into rest. The feather Chief Taji had given him hung above the mantel, turning faintly in the draft, glowing gold when the fire caught it just right. Outside, the horse shifted in the pen, snorting softly as wind swept down from the ridge, carrying the faint echo of drums far away. A reminder that the world beyond still lived, still remembered. Jonas poured a little whiskey into a tin cup, the same one he'd used through too many winters, and raised it toward the feather. "To mercy," he said quietly, "and to those who don't forget it." He drank, the warmth spreading through him slower than it once had, but deeper, settling in places where guilt had lived too long. The door creaked as it moved in the wind, and for a moment he imagined Naya standing there again, her hair braided, her eyes bright with that fearless calm. He smiled at the thought, knowing she was back among her people, healing others the way she'd healed him. He set another log on the fire, the sparks lifting like a handful of stars, and thought of how every kindness leaves its own smoke trail across time, faint but never lost. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, soundless, infinite, covering the blood, the ashes, and the broken tracks until the whole valley looked new. Jonas stepped to the doorway, leaning against the frame, his breath mingling with the cold air. The sky was wide, streaked with light, and in it he saw the shape of a hawk gliding slow beneath the moon. He remembered Naya's words, "Never let fear steal wind." He smiled, the ache in his chest easing like ice breaking under spring. Behind him, the fire popped, a single ember shooting up the chimney and disappearing into the night. If stories like this remind you that even the wildest hearts can find their way home, the narrator's voice softened, then stay a while. There's another waiting beyond the next horizon.